All right, let's bring in Ben Wagner. He joins us now live from The Hague. He is a professor of media, technology, and society in Holland. All right, Ben, good to have you. The government is saying that it's protecting children from being addicted to online gaming, whereas others have viewed it as the government cracking down on digital spaces for data and controlling the way that people communicate in the outside world. What are your thoughts?
So it clearly fits into the existing rules that we have where China is trying to clamp down on big tech, and it sees big tech and technology companies both inside and outside of China as a threat to its being able to control the narrative over what is appropriate in society, how human beings should interact, and what sort of communication should take place between different Chinese citizens and also communication between citizens in China and the outside world. And I think it's important to keep in mind in this context, this is a part of sort of a wider culture wars. So an appeal to conservative values in this context flows into these culture wars. And it needs to be seen in this context. This is not just about limiting or trying to protect young people. It's also about trying to portray young people as addicts and ensuring, claim at least, that government quotas will ensure that young people's time is well spent. So I really think this is much more about trying to shape the narrative that young people see and that trying to regain control over that narrative the government perceives that they have lost. And in the process of that, of course, doing things that go far beyond what would normally be possible in this context.
And to be fair, though, this clamping down on big tech is not specific to China. We're seeing it in the United States as well as in Brussels, too, minus that whole narrative of trying to shape the youth with their ethics.
Definitely. I think that there's a global push right now to regulate big tech more broadly. And there's a sort of a recognition that there have been lots of things that have gone wrong in different parts of the world, where then there's a need to push back by governments in many parts of the world. I think the difference is that the attempt to push back in China is very much more about shaping a narrative that it has control over, whereas in other parts of the world, it's more trying to ensure that individuals have rights and that individuals have control over the media spaces themselves. So giving back control to the user is at the center of the debate in many parts of the world, in Europe and the US. Whereas if you look at the Chinese example, it's very much about giving government the control of this narrative. And really, the politics that are in place here, if you look at the way that the Chinese government describes computers as opium, which is a sort of a very symbolically laden word, and also the way in which they're talking about these things, it's about like waving a flag or about sort of very symbolic politics. It's not so much about the actual implementation of these policies, because as your previous commentators have already acknowledged, they're extremely difficult to circumvent.
Yeah, I mean...
sorry, extremely easy to circumvent. They're very easy to get around.
Spiritual opium, I've heard that term being used as well. All right, talking about control, I mean, the online gaming industry, I mean, how much of a concern is it when it comes to security for the Chinese government?
So I don't think they're primarily concerned about security in terms of having clandestine groups that talk to each other and online gaming platforms across the border. I really think it's more of a concern about sort of the wider narrative and how they can keep control over that narrative. So they're very concerned about seeing spaces which they perceive that they can't have control over, and then systematically closing down those spaces, limiting those spaces, and making those spaces easier for the government both to access and then to limit. And I think that this is sort of it plays to a popular narrative about culture wars, about this context in which young people can't be trusted to spend their time in a way that they have control over it themselves. And so they need to be told how to spend their time. And not only is that quite far away from the everyday life experience of young people in those places, but it's also widely away from what would actually be needed in terms of if a clampdown were to take place that actually gives young people agency over their time and control to be able to understand what is happening in these games. Yep. And so what is left is a very sort of one-sided government narrative, which is trying to ensure that if anybody has control, then at least it has to be the Chinese government.
Okay. Ben Wagner, pleasure having you on. I do appreciate the analysis. Thank you.